All right, everyone, welcome back to our series on the ancient Greeks. So, today we're going to be talking about Greek culture and the contributions of the Greeks to Western civilization. So, getting into it, let's talk about the Golden Age of Pericles. So, this is the time between the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. We're getting into that again a little bit. So, this is the Golden Age in Athens. We're going to see a lot of cultures thriving during this. So Pericles, he is going to extend democracy to most of the adult males who live in Athens. He had Athens rebuilt after the Persian Wars, including building the Parthenon, as we've talked about before. And this is when we're going to see Hellenic or Greek culture really start to grow and flourish. All right. Now, the Parthenon, which is the great temple to Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. It's built at the top of the Acropolis. It's like one of the greatest examples of Greek architecture that is still standing today. And Hellenic is also, because it's talking about Greek, but also basic, ordered, and simple Greek like design. So yeah, it's just like it's what that stereotypical idea of ancient Greece that you think of. Okay. Now, the Greek arts, we're going to see painting, sculpting becoming these great examples of like the human form being portrayed. So, sculptures like architecture is going to be during this time period, the Golden Age. It's going to reach its height, the best examples. So, the sculptor Phidias is in charge of the Parthenon sculptures that are being carved, like this humongous statue of Athena that was put inside of it. If I recall correctly, it is no longer standing today. I don't know what happened to the statue actually. But we're also going to see the work of this other sculptor, Praxiteles, uh, which is going to show, as a result of the Peloponnesian War, where sculptures are more life size, more delicate, depicting ordinary people instead of gods and heroes. So more very lifelike. Whereas Phidias, his statues like of Athena are huge. All right. So Phidias, he also did the statue of Zeus that is at the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, which is like near Mount Olympus, where the Olympics were held, that type of stuff. Um, this statue is considered to be one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. It was made out of course, stone, but also ivory. So that is like the tusks of like elephants and the horns of rhino, stuff like that, as well as gold. And it was a good 42 feet tall, this statue. And yeah, it was enormous, and it filled up the like that entire temple. Now, drama, we're going to see a lot of like growth as well. So they were among the first to write and perform plays, uh, and there would be two times a year to that they would be performed to honor Dionysus, the god of the theater and all that. We talked about him before. Uh, Most Greek plays were typically tragedies, where the lead character would struggle against fate only to be doomed to an unhappy ending. All right. So, like one of the best examples would be Oedipus, which is a play that where there is a king who he and his wife give birth to a son, and it is prophesied by a this mystic woman, like an oracle, who predicts the future, that this child, when he grew up, would kill his father and marry his mother. So they basically gave the baby to a servant and said, go leave it in the woods for it, the baby to die, so that would never come true. Little do they know, about 20 years go by, the baby survived. He's now a young man. Him and the king cross paths on the road, get into a fight, and the young man kills the king, not knowing that it was the king or that they were related or anything. Then he goes to that city, meets the queen, and they end up, falling in love and getting married, only to find out sometime later, like a couple of years later, that they're actually mother and son. And then he ends up gouging out his own eyes with a knife. And yeah, that play ends very tragically, and it's very messed up. So that's one example of these early Greek tragedies. Now, we would also see comedy, uh, and it's going to be some very important playwrights. There's Aeschylus, who he is going to write a trilogy called the Orestia that shows the consequences of one's deeds and how they're carried down generation to generation. So, like the sins of the father affect the son type of deal. Then there is Sophocles, who in his writing, accepted human suffering as unavoidable, but stressed human courage and compassion. Oedipus Rex is one of his, what that I just told you about. Yeah. Then there is Euripides, which is the last Greek one to write tragedies, and he focused on human characteristics that bring disaster upon them, like someone who has a compulsive personality, and they lose all their money gambling type of deal. All right. The Olympic Games, one of the most iconic contributions of Greece to the world, especially when it comes to cooperation on an international level. So the Greeks believed in healthy bodies and, would make the best use of nature's gifts in this way. And they would stress athleticism in as a part of their education systems. So ancient Greeks, they would hold these Olympic Games every 4 years to honor the god Zeus. They would play it. They would have these games at Olympia, at the base of Mount Olympus. Trade and war stopped during the games. Greeks would not march to war during the Olympics every 4 years. Nobody did. There was everything else was put on hold to participate in the games. Male athletes, they came from all over Greece. Anywhere that people spoke Greek, they went there to compete in the Olympics. Women were allowed to participate in games of their own at Olympia that honored the goddess Hera. They did not commingle with each other. There was a male Olympics and a female Olympics, essentially. So, in keeping with Greek emphasis on the individual, the Olympic competition took form of individual competition instead of in team events. So, running track, not like a relay race, no relay races. It was like the sprint, chariot races, wrestling matches, archery competitions, the javelin throw, the shot put, the hammer throw, stuff, the discus, all stuff like that, where it's one on one. Like there's no team efforts. It's whatever you can do as an individual. And as I'm sure you can imagine, stuff like the wrestling or boxing, stuff like that, the Spartans were especially good at. And one of the things to know is that most of these sporting events, the competitors were actually in the nude. That because for wrestling, that way there was nowhere to hide like a blade or something, so you slice up your opponent while you're fighting. So a number of basically they would fight nude. All right, now let's talk about the Sophists. These were the professional teachers who provided education in ancient Greece, particularly in the 400s BC. They rejected the belief that gods and goddesses influenced human behavior and that we all make up our own minds. They asserted that man is the measure of all things and that truth is different for each individual. Like we all are our own people and the way we perceive things is our own. No one can force us to believe a certain way, that type of deal. Now let's talk about Socrates. Now, Socrates, he believed in absolute rather than relative truth. Like there are concrete facts about how the world works, not what we think the case is. He is also known as the father of philosophy as we know it. He was one of those guys, he asked questions. He encouraged people to go and ask questions. So he would encourage his students to, you know, to seek truth and to ask questions of, the elders of the city. And he actually would be executed in Athens under the charge of corrupting the youth because he got them to ask questions and to want to understand how things work and why they are the way they are. And this type of teaching technique became known as the Socratic method, where there's discussion and finding out answers together type of deal. All right, we get Plato, who is perhaps one of the most famous of Socrates' students. He is the writer of the earliest book on political science. It's called The Republic. And it is showing like an ideal society and government, like the idea of utopia. Plato, he disliked Athenian democracy, believing that giving lower classes too much freedom resulted in social disorder. He believed that only the social elite, the people who are most educated, who are the most intelligent, should be the only ones participating in government. So there's some questionable stuff in what he believes, that like not everybody should be able to take part. But he believed that the real world was, a reflection of true reality, which could only be understood through rational reflection. So basically, like what you see is the truth. All right, let's talk about Aristotle, who is a student of Plato. Now, he believed that the universe could only be understood through observation and logic. He wrote a lot of books on science and philosophy, government, basically everything under the sun. He was one of the most sought-after teachers of the ancient world for the Greeks. He taught Alexander the Great, and he taught the golden mean, or the golden rule. So, like, do unto others as you would do unto yourself, that type of deal. But unlike Plato, Aristotle would stress the value of knowledge gained through the senses. So, like, learning through experience. All right, now, moving on from him, a way to remember the order of these, like, important people. Socrates taught Plato, who taught Aristotle, who taught Alexander the Great. Spa. All right. This is a famous painting right here. If I remember correctly, it's called like the Library of Alexandria, and you have like all the important thinkers of the ancient Greek world being portrayed in it, including the goddess of wisdom, Athena, on the right, and Apollo on the left, who was also a god known for his intelligence. All right, writers of history. We get them from the Greeks as well. We have Herodotus, who's really known as like the father of history, of writing down events that can be studied in the future. He was the first to separate fact from legend. It's like, here are the actual events as they happened. Anything else is just a fantasy story. Right, he would travel all around the Persian Empire, where the Greeks were setting up colonies all over Greece, asking questions, recording the answers, checking the sources to make sure that the answers are true. And like his famous work was called the Persian Wars. Like, we know the events of the Persian Wars, the last stand of the 300, the Battle of Plataea, the Battle of Salamis, how large the Persian army was. We know this because of Herodotus's writings. Then we have Thucydides, who wrote about the Peloponnesian War, And he was regarded as the first scientific historian, all right? Because he completely did away with the idea of gods playing part in human history. And he wrote, the Peloponnesian Wars. So his is even more accurate than Herodotus, Thucydides. All right, poetry. The most famous one that you get to really know about is Homer, who wrote the story, well, we don't know for certain in the historian community whether Homer was a single person or if he is a conglomeration or a combination of multiple people who told these stories. Okay? But the stories are the Iliad, which is the story of the final years of the final year of the Trojan War, but it gives like a recap at the beginning of the events that lead up to it. And the other one is the Odyssey, which is the story of the Greek king Odysseus during his 10-year journey after fighting in the 10-year-long Trojan War to get home to his kingdom of the island of Ithaca. All right, first scientists and mathematicians. So we are going to see them really expanding on the ideas of science, talking about like astronomy and math. Now, Pythagoras, for those of you who are taking the upper level math classes, Pythagorean theorem comes from this guy. You can thank the Greeks. All right. And, the whole idea of the triangles, all the math with triangles, you can thank Pythagoras. We have Hippocrates, who is the father of medicine. He was the first healer to view medicine as a science and not as a religious thing. So he's going to promote hygiene and preventative medicines like taking herbs to keep the body healthy. Now, and if you want to go into the medical field as a career in the future, like a nurse or a doctor, you have to take what is called the Hippocratic Oath. Starts out, first do no harm. That's like what the big thing for doctors. It is named after Hippocrates. All right. Archimedes, another mathematician, engineer. He would design and improve simple machines. All right. So like the lever for like helping lift objects. The screw, like a corkscrew type of thing. Water displacement. So the whole idea of figuring this out is like you want to figure out how much mass something has. So he figured out that like submerging something in water, you can measure how much the water level rises and calculate, the size of something. And that was like the eureka moment. It's like, I got it. That's basically what eureka means. He would be hunted down and killed by the Romans during the Punic Wars because he was the first Punic War, I should say, because there were 3 of those. That was fought over control of the island of Sicily between the Romans and the Carthaginians. We get more into that stuff a little bit when we talk about Rome starting next week. But he was a big part of the defense of a city that was being besieged by the Romans. And when they got in, they found him and they killed him. Euclid, he wrote Elements. It was like the first textbook for geometry. All right. Now, the last page that we're going to look at today is talking about some architecture, the way to tell the difference between the Greek architectures. Doric is the earliest, so earlier in Greek history. Very simple. It was used in the Parthenon, this design. But then we have Ionic, which would be later on. So like after the Parthenon was built, you would see more Ionic, where it's a little bit more elaborate. But then there's Corinthian. This is the most elaborate design of architecture that you're going to see with the Greeks, and it's more Hellenistic era, which is after Hellenic, and there's more Asian influence. This would be like the time of Alexander the Great and afterward, because he went and he conquered what wasn't like he conquered Asia basically. So he brought back all of these Asian ideas and styles with him and his army when they returned from their conquests. So that's where that comes from. Now, that is it for today. When we come back next time, we will be talking about Alexander the Great. So you're not going to want to miss out on that, guys. It's a pretty interesting one.